The big question is, how do teenagers using cannabis reshape their developing brains? Or, alternatively, why will I discourage my kids from smoking cannabis until they're older? This new review out of Italy covers 36 studies in a range of study types, involving more than 8,000 direct participants and hundreds of thousands of adolescents in the public health data. The studies include brain scan data, where the results are pretty repeatable and solid, as well as measurements of cognitive effects, where the results are more mixed. We will walk through the paper's abstract together to get a sense of what we know and what we don't. I'm Lex Pelger. I'm a drug writer focused on cannabinoid science. I'm sponsored by the National Cannabis Study out of Johns Hopkins. For the National Cannabis Study, they're looking for adults who are interested in trying cannabis for a medical purpose within the next 2 months. If you know of anyone planning to use cannabis to help with sleep, anxiety, pain, cancer, or any other reason, they can join this study and add to the data, as well as getting paid $100 for their time. Look up the National Cannabis Study for more information, and there you can join their newsletter where twice a month I curate the best of the new clinical cannabinoid science. Now, as someone who loves this plant and still uses it most evenings, I do feel lucky that I didn't actually start using it until my late teens. As you'll see in this review of the data, while the data is quite messy, as you would expect with any collection of studies on teens and drug use to be, it does seem like an earlier age of initiating cannabis use is associated with increased levels of some of the symptoms that we'll be talking about here. And I will also say, as someone who's been covering cannabinoid science for a long time, the findings from this review do make gut sense to me. They dovetail with what I've been seeing over the last 10 years in the public health data around this subject, as well as what effects you see in the preclinical studies in animal models. There is a whole universe of giving THC and cannabis to teenage rats and adolescent mice and measuring the effects on their brains that we won't be able to get into in this video. But it did lead me to an idea for a science fiction novella on that subject that will be a buddy road trip kind of piece. Now let's go to the abstract. For this paper, 2 reviewers went through over 3,400 papers and read 156 of them to finally select the 36 studies analyzed here. They included 23 longitudinal cohorts, which is where you follow a large group of people for a long period of time, 8 cross-sectional studies, where you observe a group of people over a short period of time, for example, a survey, and 4 randomized controlled trials, the so-called gold standard of biomedical research. But they're expensive to do, and with something as complex and messy as teens and cannabis use, they're not always big enough to tell you much. First, in the neuroimaging studies, of which there were 20, overall they found several dose-dependent alterations, including reduced prefrontal cortical and hippocampal amygdala volumes. This means greater cannabis use was linked to greater reductions in the size of the prefrontal cortex, the executive part of your brain up here in the front, as well as the hippocampus, which is a primary brain area for memory formation and storage, and for the amygdala, a center for emotional processing, often linked to your fight or flight response. For instance, this study found that in adults who had been heavy cannabis users for an average of 20 years, they had, on average, a hippocampus that was 12% smaller and an amygdala that was 7% smaller, with greater size reductions linked to heavier use. Plus, this reduced size was correlated with sub-threshold symptoms of psychosis, also known as attenuated psychotic symptoms. These are the first early signs of the psychotic experience. However, these were the so-called positive symptoms of psychosis. Those are the ones that are additions to your experience, instead of the negative symptoms where things are missing from your experience, like memories. These sub-threshold positive psychotic symptoms include things like unusual thought content, suspiciousness or paranoia, grandiosity, which is an inflated sense of your own self-importance, also, being a teenager, disorganized or loose communication, and perceptual abnormalities, which is kind of a hallucination light, such as movements in your peripheral vision, hearing your name when no one is there, or noticing intense colors or sounds. And if some of that sounds to you like it could also describe the inner experience of a creative, out-of-the-box thinker, it does feel the same way to me. And there's a long history of speculating on the spectrum of an artist's creativity linked to their psychosis. In terms of the age of starting cannabis use, one study found that people who started using cannabis before the age of 17 showed smaller overall brain sizes compared to those who started using later in life. Also, in the longitudinal studies, you see accelerated cortical thinning. This is about your cerebral cortex, which is your brain's outer layer of gray matter. It makes the wrinkles of your brain and is one of its most important areas for processing. In some brain regions, you have a direct correlation between the thickness of your cortex and your cognitive performance or other psychiatric measures. It also influences the processing of emotions. Chronic stress can lead to thinning in certain areas and is linked to depression and anxiety, while people with thicker cortexes in certain regions can show stronger resilience and stress management, though this is highly dependent on the brain region that we're talking about. For the cortex, you can think of it like treads on a tire. They're expected to wear down, but if it gets excessive, it's a biomarker of aging or disease. Thinning can occur because neurons are shrinking or dying, or it can occur because you lose the support cells known as glial cells that are there to keep the neurons healthy. Or your cortex can shrink from something called synaptic pruning. Synaptic pruning is actually a very important part of adolescence because it's where the connections between the neurons are trimmed back so you don't have too many neuronal connections, something that's implicated in being related to schizophrenia. That gets rid of the weak or unused connections so that pathways that remain are faster and more efficient. I always think of synaptic pruning like trimming a bonsai tree, and I have a personal guess that the neuroprotective powers of cannabinoids might be interfering with this pruning process. For instance, this study on cannabis using adolescents found the cortex to be especially thin in brain areas rich in cannabinoid receptors, and that these regions are linked to greater impulsiveness. However, this study found that in heavy adolescent users over 3 years, 23 of their brain regions had thicker cortexes, which the author said suggested disrupted neuromaturation, which is probably the truth, but it might also mean that it's helping in certain brain regions and not in others. Lastly, the neuroimaging studies found impaired white matter connectivity. And if your cortex is the processing power, then the white matter connectivity is the communications cables. These are the millions of axons that crisscross the brain, carrying messages from individual neurons to faraway regions, such as in this study where heavier cannabis use is linked to more impaired connections across the corpus callosum, which is the giant cable that serves as the main connection between the right and left sides of your brain. When this brain white matter connectivity is impaired, you see lowered processing speeds. In diseases like multiple sclerosis, where white matter connectivity is the major cause, you get symptoms like difficulty following fast-paced conversations, slower reaction times in movement, and more tip-of-the-tongue moments where you can't quite find a word. And this becomes more apparent as the complexity of task increases. Because for things like reading, you're using communication between several areas of the brain, like your visual cortex, your language center, and your frontal lobe. For emotions, this also limits the ability of your logical prefrontal cortex to calm the reactions of your emotional amygdala. That's why reduced white matter connectivity is linked to severe anxiety, treatment-resistant depression, and bipolar disorder. This also affects the functional brain networks themselves. In this study of adolescents with cannabis use disorder who were seeking treatment, they had decreased connectivity between two brain regions: their anterior cingulate cortex, which is the brain's conflict monitor and emotional gear shifter, and their orbitofrontal cortex, which is the value judging center that weighs rewards against consequences. The researchers found that this greater loss of connectivity was able to predict the heaviness of the teenager's cannabis use. And over the 18 months of the study, higher amounts of cannabis use predicted a lower IQ as well as a slower cognitive functioning in their last tests. And in this study, while the cannabis users performed just as well on a task that tested their inhibition, the brain scans found that half a dozen of their brain regions had to work harder to cause that inhibition to happen. But as the researchers there stated, and I quote, "The increased brain processing effort to achieve inhibition may predate the onset of regular use or result from it." As in, maybe they were born with more inefficient inhibition, and that's why they were less inhibited about using cannabis. Or maybe it was the cannabis use that caused their inhibition to not happen as efficiently. As always, the problem here is what's causation and what's correlation. Now for the messier and more mixed cognitive findings. Some of these studies found that for people who started using cannabis as adolescents, they had persistent cognitive deficits even months or years after stopping cannabis use. But other studies found that once you controlled for confounding factors like socioeconomics and tobacco use, they found no effects at all. The most damning study might be this one out of Duke, where they analyzed over 1,000 individuals from the famous Dunedin study, where a team in New Zealand has been following 1,037 babies since their birth in 1972 and 1973. In a series of interviews given between the ages of 18 and 38, the participants were asked about their cannabis use. They then had neuropsychological testing at the age of 13 and then again at the age of 38. As these researchers summarize, and I quote, "Persistent cannabis use was associated with neuropsychological decline broadly across domains of functioning, and impairment was concentrated among adolescent onset cannabis users with more persistent use associated with greater decline. Further, cessation of cannabis use did not fully restore neuropsychological functioning among adolescent onset cannabis users. Findings are suggestive of a neurotoxic effect of cannabis on the adolescent brain." End quote. But conversely, this study combined data sets from 2 longitudinal studies looking at more than 3,000 adolescent twins. They were given intelligence tests before they were teenagers and then again as late teenagers. Those who used cannabis had lower test scores and also had a significant decline in a measure called crystallized intelligence, which is the knowledge that comes from prior learning and past experiences, basically your facts and memories. But the researchers found no evidence of a link between the frequency of someone's use and the lowering of their IQ. And even more so, when one twin used cannabis, they had no greater IQ decline than their sibling who was abstinent. So the researchers found that once you began making within-family comparisons, you substantially weakened the simple claims of cannabis use in adolescence, leading to IQ declines. And then this study talked about the potential bidirectional associations, as in some traits that might make you more likely to be a cannabis user. For instance, kids with worse short-term and working memory but higher verbal IQ were more likely to be using cannabis at an earlier age. Then, later on in young adulthood, those who started earlier and used more frequently would score worse in measures of verbal IQ and error learning. As in, some of the declines that you're measuring might actually be the result of the type of kid who will be willing to try cannabis. Meanwhile, this study found that heavy cannabis users had no IQ or educational differences between non-users, especially once you took out the smoking of cigarettes, which is the real thing that I want my kids to not be doing. And in an excellent example of mixed results and complex relationships, this study in a Philadelphia cohort found that while heavy cannabis users had worse executive control, occasional users did better than non-users on measures of executive control, memory, and social cognition. As everyone quotes Paracelsus as saying, the dose makes the poison. Now let's move on to addiction and cannabis use disorder. And while some people might think it is overdiagnosed and others might think it is underdiagnosed, most people would agree that cannabis use disorder is a real thing. I myself have struggled with the compulsive use of cannabis and still sometimes have to make sure that I'm using it in a helpful way and not in an unhealthy, escapist way. However, the 4 studies covered here are all epidemiological, as in big blocks of public health data looking at large numbers of people. This means that the complexities of people's relationship to cannabis get compressed down into a small number of buckets that may not really capture the reality. And anyway, there is not one solid definition of cannabis use disorder. In our first study, the researchers examined data from the U.S. National Household Survey on Drug Abuse, which in the year 2000 collected responses from over 114,000 teenagers. Of those who used cannabis in the previous 2 years, around 4% of them went on to develop a cannabis-dependent syndrome within 2 years of the start of their use. And on average, that occurred within just 1 year. The risk was increased for those who started using earlier in adolescence. Of course, as this study points out, the probability of transitioning from use to dependence is much lower for cannabis than for other drugs. Using another national survey, they found that for nicotine, 67% of users developed a dependence. And then for alcohol, it was 22%, for cocaine, it was 21%, and for cannabis users, just 9% had a probability of transitioning from use to dependence. So, is cannabis one of the least addictive of the most commonly used psychoactives? Of course it is, and nobody is surprised, but still, that number is not zero. And this study found that compared to people who started using cannabis as adults, teenagers who started to use cannabis had their risk of developing cannabis use disorder increase anywhere from 4 to 7 times more likely. As the author stated, and I quote, These data provide further epidemiological support that adolescence is a particularly vulnerable period for developing a substance use disorder, end quote. And finally, the last study is on the gateway effect. The idea that the use of cannabis leads to the use of other drugs and a greater risk of substance use disorders. In this public health data, for people who have ever used cannabis in their lifetime, 45% of them would go on to use other illicit drugs. This is more likely in people who had a history of mood disorders, anxiety disorders, personality disorders, or a family history of substance use disorders. But of course, the obvious rebuttal to the gateway effect is that the people who used cannabis first were going to be using those other drugs anyway. For myself, alcohol and cannabis were just the easiest first drugs to get, but I absolutely was going to be trying all of the drugs in my lifetime. There are certain personality traits that indicate a likelihood to use all the drugs, and I have those, such as lower inhibitions, higher emotional instability and depression, more sensation seeking and risk taking, and a greater openness to new experiences. So while I'm sure that some people would not have progressed to other drugs if they hadn't started cannabis quite young, for others, and maybe for most of us, I'm sure that cannabis was simply the first drug to get their hands on in a lifetime of drug seeking. So now we'll leave the messiness of cannabis use disorder there, and the last sentence of the abstract is the long-term mental health outcomes. In this quite negative study of a New Zealand birth cohort, those who started using cannabis in their teens had lower levels of education and income at the age of 25, higher levels of welfare dependence, higher unemployment, lower levels of relationship satisfaction, and lower levels of life satisfaction. And those remain true even after adjusting the data for things like socioeconomic status, family functioning, child abuse, mental health disorders, and the use of other substances. But this study went in the other direction. Using data from South Dakota grade students, the researchers found that once you controlled for cigarette smoking, the differences in low educational attainment disappeared. Now, for anxiety. This cohort study following young Australians found that while cannabis use wasn't associated with later depression, it was associated with later anxiety disorders. But once again, is that because the people with anxiety were seeking out cannabis, like I do? Or is their anxiety being exacerbated by their cannabis use, which is something you certainly hear about from people who develop anxiety or paranoia whenever they use cannabis? By the way, this is something you also see in the preclinical data. In rats and mice, cannabis can be both anxiolytic, as in it lessens their stress and makes them more likely to explore new areas, and it can also be anxiogenic, as in it turns them into shivering balls that never leave their corner. Like with any complex psychoactive, it has much to do with setting, and personal inclinations. Personally, I think the strongest teen cannabis link has to do with later psychosis. One of the most famous studies in the field is a cohort study of conscripts into the Swedish army. They found that using cannabis more than 50 times increased the risk of schizophrenia by 6 times. By the way, intriguingly, no other drug predicted later schizophrenia. But for the cannabis, these authors allowed for the fact that perhaps this was because people in the early stages of schizophrenia were using cannabis as a treatment. And it's true that there is some evidence that high levels of CBD and low levels of THC can be helpful for people with schizophrenia if used wisely and under the advice of an experienced mental health professional. For adolescents specifically, this study again looked at the Dunedin cohort out of New Zealand. And the researchers tried to make their data more robust by controlling for the presence of psychotic symptoms before the use of cannabis. They also divided it into people who started using cannabis before the age of 15 versus those who started using it by the age of 18. So while they found that those who started using cannabis by the age of 15 had a 4 times increased risk of developing some form of schizophrenia by the age of 26, this was lessened after they controlled for pre-existing childhood psychotic symptoms. The risk was still greater, it just wasn't statistically significant. For me, that tracks as cannabis having a real but moderate effect on your schizophrenia risk, and accounts for the fact that for some people with early psychosis symptoms, they might seek out cannabis as a treatment whether they know it or not. Conversely, this naturalistic field study followed 245 people who were seeking help for their mental health and were at a clinically high risk of developing psychosis. They found that a younger age of starting cannabis use or having cannabis use disorder was significantly related to having a younger age for the onset of 6 different symptoms of psychosis. And they found that in most participants, the onset of cannabis use preceded their symptoms. So as they keep saying, the data is messy and contradictory, which usually points to a real but moderate effect. One of the reasons that adolescents might be more vulnerable to symptoms of psychosis from cannabis use is because of their cannabinoid receptors. All humans have cannabinoid receptors in their brains and spread across their bodies, and the CB1 receptor is one of the most widespread receptors in the human brain. This study in rats found their levels of CB1 receptors were highest in the juvenile and adolescent stages and then started dropping towards the lower levels found in adults. And the greatest amount of change was found in the limbic regions, which are associated with emotions. So this means that human teenagers may have greater levels of CB1 receptors in the areas of their brain regulating emotions, and therefore may be at greater risk of THC activating those CB1 receptors and causing changes. Also in relation to schizophrenia is this brain study in humans where, among the cannabis users, the earlier use of cannabis or a longer history of use was related to lower levels in release of dopamine, a neurotransmitter thought to be heavily involved in schizophrenia. You also have genetic vulnerabilities. For instance, there are different genetic variants for the type of CB1 receptor that you have. In this combined brain scan genetic study, in heavy cannabis users with a certain variant of their CB1 receptor, they were more likely to have a smaller size of their hippocampus, the memory center. Then, in this study, they looked at people with two different variants of their COMT gene. This gene creates an enzyme responsible for clearing dopamine out of the synapses. One version is called the warrior, Val158, because their dopamine gets cleared more quickly and they tend to handle stress and pain better but have a slightly lower mental horsepower. The other version is called the worrier, Met158, and while these people tend to perform better on memory and logic tests, they are more prone to anxiety and they have a lower threshold for stress. Surprisingly, in those with the warrior version of the COMT enzyme, their cannabis use was not linked to later adult psychosis, but those with the warrior type of the enzyme, they were more likely to later develop psychotic symptoms and schizophrenia if they used cannabis. Lastly, though it's not mentioned in the paper's abstract, there are the differences between the biological sexes. And yes, I know, gender is just a construct, but sex is also a helpful lens for understanding the general differences that arise between those who identify as male and those who identify as female. This study looked at 69 young adult cannabis users. They found that in females, higher cannabis use was associated with worse episodic memory. In males, higher cannabis use was correlated with worse decision making. Then, this study gave tests to 59 young adult users and non-users. They found that for all participants, cannabis use was associated with lower psychomotor speed, reduced attention efficiency, and more errors of inhibition. The males were found to be more vulnerable to a slower psychomotor speed, as well as greater cognitive slowing in general. This data tracks with what you see in the prenatal exposure to cannabis data. For any of the moderate negatives you find in infants exposed to cannabinoids in the womb, the effects tend to be greater in males. Because of that Y chromosome and less genetic material, males tend to have less resilience to most insults. So, overall, for teens and cannabis use, while the neuroimaging studies on physical changes of the brain had particularly robust findings across 4 high-quality MRI studies, the studies on cognitive effects had greater variability, with 2 of the high-quality studies finding no significant effects of adolescent cannabis use after controlling for confounders, while others found significant associations. A younger age of starting cannabis use does seem to be linked to worse outcomes. So to my kids, if you're watching this years from now and I'm unexpectedly not here, Papa says that if you can wait until you're 17 or 18 like I was, that would be good. And if you wanted to wait until 21 or 22, that is probably even better. But if you're going to do it, let me or another trusted adult know, and we can work together to make sure that you're safe.